Hello, gathered friends. I'm Nuva, and welcome to Bionicle Deep Dive, where we analyze the tropes, characters, and lore of LEGO Bionicle. This video will be the first in a two-part series analyzing themes of gender in Bionicle and how they're handled throughout the series. Here in part 1, we're going to be looking at the representation of women in Bionicle, discussing the ratio of male to female characters as well as how they're written in the story. Later, in part 2, I'm going to be looking at the unique ways the trans and non-binary communities have connected with the series and how it handles gender. Let's dive right into it. So, everyone familiar with Bionicle knows that the representation of women in the series suffers greatly from what's known as the Smurfette Principle, which is a broader media trope where there's only one female character in a group of nearly all male characters. These characters are then often asked to represent the entire female gender, while the male characters get more diversity. Many times these sole female characters are placed in highly stereotypical or often sexualized roles, since it's clear the series was made and aimed towards an almost exclusively male perspective. Now, when discussing the representation of girls in Bionicle, it's important to discuss the larger context of gendered marketing in toys and children's media. Bionicle was primarily marketed towards boys aged 8 to 16. Gender segregation in the toy market is extreme, and while some toy companies, including LEGO, have taken steps in recent years to tone this down somewhat, at the time, LEGO and other companies were very interested in keeping the gendered markets separate. This is because it's very easy to make money off of people if you divide them into discrete categories with no overlap, who you can market to separately. This is to the point where companies actively did not want crossover appeal for girls to like boy toys or boys to like girl toys, because then these separate markets are competing against each other, and it's less easy to control and generate predictable profit margins. You can see this in practice in many ways, with many toy stores having completely separate aisles for boy and girl toys. Transformers, a similar toy series to Bionicle, infamously had very few female robots, and usually with very exaggerated feminine frames. And the status and lore surrounding female Transformers is infamously all over the place. Back in 2012, when the first Avengers movie came out, you could not find a Black Widow toy, despite her being one of the main 6 Avengers. Instead, more often than you'd see sets of toys with the other 5 Avengers and maybe Nick Fury. This was because Marvel executives actively blocked female superhero toys from being made because they didn't think girl superhero products would sell. We see this not only in toys, but in TV shows as well. The creators of Avatar: The Last Airbender had to fight tooth and nail to make Korra, the lead in the sequel series, a girl, because Avatar as an action-adventure cartoon was seen as more of a boys' series by Nickelodeon executives. So, with that context in mind, Bionicle having female characters at all was not a guarantee. In fact, there have been many rumors that in some of the original plans, even Gali was meant to be a man, meaning that there'd be no women in the cast. Now, in universe, among the Matoran species, gender is deeply tied to element, with, in most cases, all Matoran of a particular element being the same gender. All Toa and Matoran of water were women, while the members of the other 5 main elements groups were all men. Among the secondary elements, the number of women is similarly limited, with Psychic and Lightning being all female. Light and Shadow could be either male or female, but the rest were all male. There were rumors that the element of plant life was also going to be female at one point, but the only instance of a Toa of plant life ended up using he/him pronouns. This leaves us with 11 all-male elements, 3 all-female elements, and 2 elements that can be either. Very unbalanced, especially when you consider that even among Light and Shadow, the characters were shown majority male. Those side elements are more tangential world building, however. Among characters that actually play a significant role in the plot, we mainly deal with the primary 6 elements. And this ratio really wasn't good. It meant that girls really only had one group and set of traits to identify with, while boys had 5 completely different groups with diverse personalities and aesthetics to identify with. Girls who liked fire but didn't like water were kinda out of luck, as were boys who liked water. It also ties into the cultural idea of male as the default and female as a deviation from the norm, which is a deeply flawed and actually dangerous notion that has unfortunately ingrained itself in our culture. Dangerous in that it has limited female representation in both media, but even more critical areas like public policy and medical research. Now, this is a case of the 5-to-1 male-female ratio not only being representative of the characters shown in the cast, but an actual canon characteristic of the species in the lore. What's interesting about this is that while this did unfortunately mean that female representation would always be limited, in a strange way it also ensured that women would also be present in the story. What I mean by this is that by making it so that the Toa of Water were always female, and since every wave of heroes had a blue, water-themed character, it meant that there would always be at least one female hero in the lineup. Since it was already established lore, there would be fan backlash if this pattern were broken among the Toa and Matoran characters, because we all know how particular Bionicle fans about keeping the lore consistent. There's also evidence to suggest that having this 5-to-1 ratio actually did more to promote the inclusion of female characters rather than limit it. This is because when the sets were of non-Toa Matoran characters, and thus not necessarily bound by the same rules, more often than not, LEGO opted to make them all male rather than having a more balanced gender ratio. I remember being very surprised that the Baraka Vizok was a man, and the same with Takedox, Vampra, Terex, and Barracks, all of whom were blue characters who were male despite the blue characters traditionally being female. And their being male made the entirety of their respective set waves all men. There's only one instance of the reverse happening. Makuta Gorast, from the Mystical wave, was a green character who was made female, actually making the gender ratio 4 male to 2 female. This was most likely done to have a female villain counterpart to Gali, who was also included in that wave. Particularly when we look at the Paraka and the Baraki, and to a lesser extent the Makuta, making their blue members male had the effect of making the villains all men, while the heroes had women among them. Why they choose to do this is honestly not very clear to me, though it may have something to do with they thought the bad guys would market better as male characters. It could also be possible that they were wary about writing female villains, especially after the whole Roodaka situation, but we'll go over that more later. So, we've discussed the ratio of female characters present. Now let's actually take a look into how they were written in the story. And while, like with anything, there were certainly a few weird moments in how they were handled, I would say that, at least from my perspective, it was handled pretty well. The female characters were varied, well-developed, badass, and drove the plot. Every Bionicle arc up to 2009 also passes the Bechdel test of having at least 2 named female characters have a conversation that isn't about a man. Now, the Bechdel test was never meant to be any real achievement in feminism. It's a commentary on how few movies manage to even pass this ridiculously low bar. But it is kind of interesting that in a series that famously only has 1 in 6 characters be women, they still had enough female characters with relationships to each other to pass what other stories couldn't. Something that really needs to be noted about gender in Bionicle is that, for the most part, gender never really felt like it mattered in Bionicle. Very few of the sets had gendered appearances, they were just robot-looking. One could argue they had a slightly masculine appearances, but that really might just be the bias to see male as the default. Even if they were masculine, though, that meant the majority of female characters had these neutral to masculine body types, a rarity that sent the message that women didn't have to look in a particular, overly stereotypical feminine way. As far as how they were written, while there were instances of characters embodying gendered tropes, for the most part that didn't matter. They were all just characters. For that reason, there are plenty of proposed fan-made reboots that change the gender makeup of the characters to be more balanced and inclusive, and they usually work very well, since many of the characters could easily have been written as another gender, and it wouldn't have impacted their arc in meaningful ways. Male-female dynamics were never really shoved down our throats, and gender had little to no say in the role the characters played in the overall story. In so many other boy-marketed franchises, especially at the time, the female characters felt somewhat excluded from the group and othered. Very often it was like being a girl was their main distinguishing characteristic. Meanwhile, in Bionicle, they were integrated heavily into the group, and had traits beyond just being a girl. They were unfortunately relegated to one element, but they also played heavily with the water elemental tropes outside of their femininity, just like the other 5 elements all played with their own elemental tropes. With very few gender roles and no canonical romance in the story or world, they weren't forced into extremely reduced roles that many female characters in other similar boy-targeted media often find themselves in. While there were occasionally hints of romance, mostly as a tongue-in-cheek gag, true romance was infamously declared non-canon, which in some ways was a good thing, because it meant that no one was ever relegated to just being the love interest of another character, which happens all too often in other stories. And again, the female characters in Bionicle were always given good prominence. Each of the heroes were considered equal in the story, meaning that the female toe of water were never sidelined. Heck, in the second Minog game, we had a girl POV character as Hali, walking around and adventuring her little seaweed purse, and the entire first chapter of the game took place in the all-female village of Gakoro, showing a willingness by Bionicle to put its female characters in the spotlight. Which, again, is a big deal, because many executives were convinced that boys would be angry to have to play as or watch a girl lead. But Minog 2 was beloved for its story and characters, with the only major complaint being that it was buggy sometimes. People, including boys, wanted to play it, wanted to play as Hali, a girl. Having those strongly written female characters whose gender didn't matter to their role and didn't have to look a certain stereotypically feminine way is part of the reason why I think Bionicle became so popular among trans women. Indeed, the series has become almost a staple of trans and non-binary culture among 20 to 30-year-olds. I think that while its marketing meant that many cisgendered girls didn't get into it, the way it handled its female characters by giving them good character arcs and not relegating them to overly stereotypical and excluded roles made the closeted girls among their audience want to stick around. There was even an article on this topic written recently that's very, very good, linked to it in the description. I plan on expanding heavily on this in the second part of the series on gender and Bionicle. Now, that said, I'm not going to say that there weren't stereotypical roles for the female characters, some of which were poorly written. Particularly among the water characters, they were often portrayed as the quiet, gentle peacemakers of the group and more reluctant to fight, which does play on the idea that women are less aggressive than men and more docile. With that being said, though, even though they were generally, though very much not always, gentler, the female characters of Bionicle were also very badass and important, and filled a variety of roles. And even when they did fit into feminine tropes, that wasn't always a bad thing, especially if it was well written. Femininity is a wonderful thing, and female characters who do fit into feminine roles can be amazingly well written characters. Strong female protagonists shouldn't have to be written just like men to be taken seriously. It's when those roles become diminishing and restrictive and all that a character is allowed to be that it becomes a problem. Now, the irony is that despite what I've been saying about the underrepresentation of women in the Bionicle, the story actually had a ton of female characters owing to the fact that there's just loads and loads of characters in general. So, the ratio ended up adding up. So, I'm going to be taking a brief look at some of the most significant female characters and female groups in the series, particularly the ones who I think have an interesting relationship to gender. I'll be analyzing how they were written and how they embodied, played with, or subverted various gender stereotypes about women. And I'll try to keep them short and focused, but don't worry, I definitely have plan on going into character videos for almost all of these characters, dive into them more in depth individually. We do see that there are many feminine stereotypes in the culture of the Gamatorn, the Matorn of Water, as the Gamatorn are noted for being the most peaceful of the 6 villages. But we also see much variety among them, as well as tropes that are more about their connection to water than just their gender. Each of them are unique and quirky in their own ways. Since their village was all female, there's no gender roles, and all jobs were done by women. In Gakoro, we see them acting as sailors, fisherwomen, crafters, merchants, weavers, gardeners, athletes, and guards. And their connection to water also shows up in non-gendered ways, with them being incredible swimmers and sailors. The very first Gamatorn we see, Maku, is noted for being a great athlete and canoeer who loves to explore the island in her boat. She famously had a strongly hinted, but infamously never canonized, romance with Huki from Pokoro. And while it was a bit stereotypical to put the only female Matorn we got at the time into a romantic pairing, she had tons of character outside of it, actually being a little bit more prominent than her crush, at least at the time during the 2001-2002 story arcs, which generally doesn't happen to male-female pairings. Now, Hyuki would go on to become significantly more prominent in stories in the later half of the series, while Maku faded as a background character, but by that time plenty of more female characters came along to fill Maku's two-toed shoes. As far as the role of Ga-Matorn in the city of Metru Nui, in the water district of Ga-Metru, one of the most prominent jobs they performed was as teachers, which is a little bit of a stereotypical job to put in the all-women district. However, it should be noted that education in Ga-Metru was more along the lines of university professors, and their role in higher learning was treated with immense respect. And teaching wasn't the only job there, just perhaps the most prestigious. Many Ga-Matorn were in fact students in academia, or worked in the chemistry labs which experimented on and purified the liquid protodermis that used by the rest of the city. Ga-Metru was also noted as being the most spiritual and serene of the districts of Metru Nui, and the home to the great temple that all types of Matoran came to revere. Now, as far as the main heroes, the Toa of Water, particularly Gali and Nokama, tended to act as the feminine voice of reason and the peacekeeper of their group, having great respect for unity and working together. They are also known for being the slowest of violence and the least willing to harm creatures. On the other hand, the story never shied away from making the female Toa badass. When needed, the Toa of Water were ass-kickers, and every bit as tough as powerful as their male counterparts. Though they preferred to be peaceful, they showed their enemies the wrath of the ocean is terrible indeed. And in their sets at least, they were depicted just as buff and tough as the other Toa. Muscular-looking toys depicting women were a big rarity, both then and today, and having them look just as bulky and strong as the male Toa was pretty progressive. And yeah, I know that, in the sets it's not actual muscle but their armor, but still, it's very obviously meant to mimic bulk muscle. Though other visual depictions tend to try and feminize their appearances to mixed results. One of the few complaints I do have about Gali's portrayal, especially in relation to gender, is really her character model in the Mask of Light movie, specifically her chest armor. It's clear they were attempting to feminize her design because, well, let's be real, her set doesn't look particularly feminine, but honestly, again, that's not a bad thing. But in the movie, they massively shrink her chest plate to about half the size of the male Toas. And while it does give a more stereotypical feminine, skinny hourglass silhouette, the lack of armor, in my opinion, makes her look unprotected and undermines the idea that she's just as tough as the others, since it makes her look completely different. She's a 7-foot-tall biomechanical warrior. I think she should be allowed to have a little bulk. And even if they wanted to make her design more feminine, I think they could have done it without making her armor look kind of, well, flimsy. Thankfully, though, I do think they did a much better job in later movies. In contrast to Gali, Nakama's movie form is a way better way of depicting a feminine Toa body type, at least in my opinion. Rather than dramatically reducing her armor for the sake of a silhouette, Nakama, for the most part, looks like the other Toa, just slightly shorter with slightly wider hips and a different design over her chest armor. She's distinctly more feminine without compromising how strong she looks or making her stand apart from her teammates. Her Turaga form in the first movie, though, is oh my god. See, it looks like the standard Turaga model, and it is, but on her torso there's a little Easter egg that, when I was a kid, I thought was just an abstract flowing water symbol on her chest, but no. That's drawn-on cleavage on her chest armor. Oh my god, why? Of the Toa of Water, I think Hali is particularly interesting for this conversation, as she both embraces and deeply subverts feminine tropes arguably more than any other Toa of Water. Especially as a Matoran, she's very feminine, having flowers in her mask and walking around with a little seaweed purse, and her character arc can be described as a shy girl who was afraid to speak her mind, slowly gaining confidence and rising to new roles. Although she has hints of flirting with Jaller, she's never reduced by this, and their friendship ends up strengthening both of their characters. Jaller serves as a major inspiration for her big moment in the movie, where through the confidence and understanding she's gained on her journeys, she brings the island together in an amazing show of unity. And as a Toa, she continued to gain confidence in her power, while still being a strong emotional center for the team. Eventually, she swings full the other way, completely dropping her meek persona and famously becoming Hali the Barbarian by the time of Mari Nui, becoming a very bold and sometimes brutal fighter while in combat. Though she gains this extremely tough warrior-like attitude while fighting, she never loses her sweetness or sensitivity during quiet moments, even being unafraid to openly cry, and this isn't treated as a bad thing. Now, Dalu, the Gamatoran member of the Voyanui Resistance, is another interesting case in that she is self-aware that she subverts many of the Gamatoran traits, including traditional femininity. Dalu was the lead fighter of the group and was aggressive, confrontational, and slow to show affection, in direct contrast to typical water characters we've seen up until now. She even has an argument with Hali about her demeanor, where she says that Gamatoran from Metronui might all be gentle peacekeepers who never raise their voices, and that it was like that where she was originally from too, but her harsh experiences have taught her the value of fighting. Like so many of the Voyanui characters, she represents a subversion of the expectations set by previous arcs. Two very significant subversions of the typical Toa of Water tropes come from Helryx and Tuyet, two characters created by Greg Farshi that feature prominently in the side stories. Helryx is the very first Toa ever created, and the leader of the Order of Matanui, two very important titles that it's very cool to see go to a female character. Particularly as the lead of the Order, she is in a prominent leader position over one of the most powerful factions in the universe, and commanded many extremely powerful characters, nearly all of whom had been male by the time she had been introduced. Helryx broke from the typical Toa of Water mold in that she was very willing to be ruthless to get the job done, a necessity in her position. She lacked the gentleness and passionate caring that was typical for characters like Gali, Nukama, and Hali. Instead, she had a fierce temper and a willingness to make sacrifices for what she believed is the greater good. Tuyet, the tyrannical Toa Mangai of water, goes even further from typical water tropes. Instead of a deep reverence for the sanctity of life, Tuyet was a brutal murderer and tyrant, a complete inversion of the gentleness typical of Toa of Water. Now, it should be noted that these two, who are among the most politically powerful female characters of the Matoran species, achieved their power and leadership by abandoning the traits that made other water characters seem feminine, which does tie into an idea prevalent in our culture that for women to be strong leaders, they have to embrace masculine traits. Of course, we shouldn't just look at one side of this. The topic of male representation and masculinity is also pretty interesting in Bionicle when you look at it. Because, as I said before, boys who were into Bionicle had a wide variety of tropes that were aligned with male characters, many of which weren't even particularly masculine. If you really look at it, of the 5 main male elements, only 2 really primarily embody masculine stereotypes in my view, those being stone and fire. Fire for its aggressive tendencies and how fire characters were consistently put in leadership roles, and stone for its association with rugged rowdiness and athletics, all traits that our culture has decided are masculine, despite anyone being able to have them. Particularly, I feel like Tahu's character arc can be seen as a journey of overcoming toxic masculinity, and embracing a more balanced and healthy form of masculine strength. But even still, an arc centered around overcoming anger issues is by no means an exclusively male one, and Tahu easily could have been written as a woman to great effect. The other 3 male elements, on the other hand, ice, air, and earth, all embody traits that, at least in my view, are either a mix of masculine and feminine, or are considered kind of gender neutral. Now, one could argue that there is a loose patriarchy in Matoran society, given that leadership positions are most often filled by fire types, which are all male, and arguably the most stereotypically masculine of the types. This is most glaring during the 2004 Metronui arc, where the sole Turaga ruler, as well as the only remaining Toa of the city before the Toa Metru, were both fire types. One very controversial choice around the theme of elements and gender stereotypes revolves around one of the other female elements, psionics, in particularly Toa Ord. Ord was the very first Toa of psionics and was actually male, unlike all the others. Up until his introduction in the post-ending serials, The psychic element was established as an exclusively female one, which, a little stereotypical, but received fairly well. But Ord actually threw a wrench into it. His backstory is that he was essentially the prototype for the psychic type Toa, and on one of his early missions was tasked to try and calm the Zyglak down from their violent anger. However, Ord was a bit of a hothead at the time, and his aggressive use of his powers ended up pushing the Zyglak further into murderous rage. After this, the Great Beings decided that a gentler touch was needed for this power, and subsequent Matoran and Toa of Psionics were made female. So, it's interesting that it was now explicitly written that the element-gender ratio is the way it is because of the gender biases of the Great Beings, which in a meta way is kind of commentary on how out-of-universe the reason for it is because of the biases of LEGO, the story team, and the gendered toy market. Especially since immediately afterwards, Chiara, a Toa of Lightning traveling with them, immediately zaps a lizard with electricity while she sarcastically comments on how females are so gentle. So it's very clear that subversion was on the mind of Farshti while he was writing this. In one of the online dialogues, Greg Farshti seems to imply that part of the point of this decision was to show the biases of the Great Beings, and that the general society of Sirius Magna as well, and that had the story continued, topics such as bias, prejudice, and clashing cultures would have been a major topic, but that storyline was never finished, so we don't really know how that would have played out. On the other hand, Ord being male had the practical effect of enforcing the Smurfette Principle for the serial The Yesterday Quest, since it meant Chiara was the only woman on the team. Even more jarring considering that, on paper, the element makeup of that group would have been an even number of men and women, and a majority female Toa to act as the powerhouses of the team. Commentary on sexism that ends up being kinda sexist on a practical level. What are you gonna do? It did end up having a slightly negative reception among fans, since it was kind of a weird choice, though it did spawn a variety of trans and non-binary headcanons surrounding Ord and other Toa of Psionics. Now, let's move to other characters outside of the Matoran species who aren't a part of the gender element connection. Now, we wouldn't be able to have this discussion without talking about Roodaka, who is, very interesting with regards to ideas of femininity. First, let's start with her actual set figure. While the vast majority of sets didn't add any distinctly feminine features onto the female characters, it seems LEGO very much tried to code Roodaka's set as female. The Rakshi heads on her chest seemed intended to resemble breasts, her feet were shaped to be like high heels, and the pieces on the back of her head resemble hair put into a ponytail, which was even further emphasized in the movie depiction. And then we have her characterization. Roodaka is a femme fatale through and through. The definition of the femme fatale trope is a woman who uses charm, manipulation, and seduction to trick male characters into dangerous or deadly involvement with them, which is exactly what she did to Vakama. Particularly in the movie, she is played incredibly seductive, with even some hints of dominatrix thrown in there. It's clear her voice actor, who was actually the same woman who voiced Gali in Mask of Light, was having fun with the role. Roodaka is the only Bionicle character that can really be considered sexualized, a fact that actually made her one of the only two sets that were truly controversial. The other being Prydak for his, natural red markings around his shark-like jaws. The controversy around her set and depiction made her unique in Bionicle, as they never again tried to make a set with an overtly feminine body type. Which is kind of a shame, because I think that feminine body types that were maybe a little bit less sexualized could have been a cool idea in some of the toys. Roodaka is an immensely manipulative schemer, who uses carefully drawn-out plans with tons of contingencies. However, her role as a manipulator didn't make her any less powerful. In terms of raw strength, she's a powerhouse, and they definitely don't shy away from her being an ass-kicker. In many ways, her combination of multi-layered plans and terrifying physical power makes her essentially a mini Makuta, which fits given that one of her defining traits was her admiration and devotion to Makuta pterodax. Her devotion, particularly in the movie, reads strongly as an almost romantic infatuation. Everything she does during the Roodaka arc is in an effort to free him, to the point where she even risks her life in a gamble to trick the Toa into breaking his prison. Her love for Makuta is interpreted in a number of ways. On the one hand, some see it as playing into the trope of female characters, particularly female villains, being reduced to being motivated by a male character. However, I don't think her character is actually reduced by this. She remains a very well-developed, layered, and interesting villain all throughout. Her devotion is a singular point of caring in an otherwise completely self-centered and power-hungry character. It makes for an interesting contrast to Sidorak, who doesn't care for his boss and even entertains fantasies about becoming the new Master of Shadows. While poorly done versions of this trope are overdone, there's nothing wrong with a character being motivated by their admiration for another, especially when it's well written and they remain their own person. And it's also very fitting for Roodaka's character that she would have deep admiration for someone who embodies every strength she values. And if you think about it, even her backstory kind of plays on tropes of being an ambitious woman in a male-dominated field. I mean, she's a woman who, despite being one of the most competent members of her organization, is passed over for promotions in favor of her boastful male coworker, who takes credit for all her ideas and also tries to hit on her. I know there's a lot of women who can relate to that workplace experience. Roodaka is also part of the only pair of characters in the series who actually have an explicit romantic subplot, given her engagement to Sidorak. And yes, they do actually use the term engagement in the movie, and even the term marriage in the novelization. And, of course, the explanation in this decidedly non-romantic world is that the marriage was primarily a political alliance, which was true. Sidorak wanted influence in Roodaka's homeland of Zia, and Roodaka would be Queen of the Visorak and his equal. There was no real sex or anything like that involved, but still, it's a real example of Roodaka bringing in gendered tropes all on her own. So we see that Roodaka was an extremely gendered character in almost every aspect of her characterization. And while I sympathize with people who think they went a little too far with the female villain stereotypes, I do think she was a very well written character. Not despite, but even because of how she plays with these tropes. Honestly, I wonder if what made her so controversial is the fact that she felt so much more gendered than any other Bionicle character, and that it was jarring compared to the rest of Bionicle, which was a much more gender-neutral to masculine world aesthetic. And while we're on the topic of Roodaka, we should also talk about the lore surrounding her species, the Vortex, who were an intensely matriarchal society on their home island of Zia, a major manufacturer and weapons dealer. The women of Zia consistently held positions of power in the society, like lead designer and overseer, while the men generally did the hardest and dirtiest jobs in the factories. There was some capacity for male Vortex to rise above their station, particularly if they completed the rites of passage of going up the carnivorous mountain on their island, but it was still a heavily woman-led society. It should be noted that this is the only society in the Matoran universe that has an explicit gender discrimination. Matoran society has the genders being treated more equally, though there are significantly less female Matoran than male. So, it was probably put in there to contrast real-world societies that are much more patriarchal. Not completely sure why they put it in there and what exactly they were trying to say, except maybe a weird reverse sexism take, but maybe it does explain a lot about Roodaka that she hails from an island of girl bosses. Also, Roodaka wasn't the only female villain to have the hots for Pterodax. The other was Makuta Gorast, Pterodax's most fierce loyalist within the Brotherhood of Makuta, and the only female Makuta shown in the series. Gorast was a bloodthirsty warrior and arguably one of the best fighters among the Brotherhood, with only Ikarak confirmed to be more skilled. She was definitely among the most brutal villains in the series. Her inclusion among the Mystica alongside Gali also marked the first time there were two female canister sets in a wave, and she was also the only canister set to depict a female villain. Her fanatical loyalty to Pterodax has been interpreted by some as being in love with him, despite there never being any real romantic implication, but I definitely see it. Romantic or not, she had a very strong admiration of Pterodax that was her driving motivation during the Cardanui arc. Some view this as reducing her arc, especially since, with Roodaka, these two most prominent female villains both have arcs that focus heavily on their devotion to the male big bad. At the same time, Gorath's fanaticism led to her being a terrifying villain, both against the heroes and other Brotherhood members she found disloyal. And it also made her final betrayal and death all the more tragic, as the being she devoted her entire life to threw her away the second she became a loose end. Now, another female villain worth mentioning is Lariska, the knife-wielding Dark Hunter assassin. In a lot of ways, she fits with many tropes that have become associated with female villains, particularly assassin types, being extremely, lithe and agile, and also playing a somewhat femme fatale role, given how she seduced Nidiki to abandon the Toa and join the Dark Hunters. Unlike Roodaka, though, she isn't really sexualized, and we don't even see her appearance, and her relationship with Nidiki, while somewhat flirtatious in the right light, can also be viewed as just a friendship. Lariska is also noted for being an extremely high-ranking Dark Hunter, one of the most terrifying Toa killers, and holds such respect and fear over her fellow hunters that the Shadowed One placed her in charge temporarily while he was gone. While on the surface she's a pretty straightforward, deadly assassin character, there's actually a surprising amount of depth hinted at in her character, particularly the surprising amount of care she shows to Nidiki. If you want to see more discussions and a lot of gushing about her character, I highly recommend checking out the fan Kurika, also known as Cannoli Volatak on Tumblr, who loves this terrifying knife lady and has pieced together tremendous depth out of her relatively limited appearances. Link to their blog in the description, and just search the Lariska tag. Okay, so while the inhabitants of the Torn universe clearly had some very weird gender shenanigans, the way gender was handled in the Bara Magna arc was honestly weirder. And worse. It was worse. Now, the Agori and Glutorian were all naturally occurring, primarily organic beings, who did have biological reproduction, at least according to the Chat with Greg dialogues. You'd think that because of this, they'd have more female characters, since they weren't bound by the pre-existing rules of canon and gender weirdness of the MU. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. There was only one significant female character introduced in the entirety of the 2-year Bara Magna arc, Kina, who was noted for being the only female Glutorian to become one of the village's primary fighters. In the initial winter wave, there were no female characters. There weren't even any female Agori villagers introduced. And this just goes to show what I was talking about, how there's clearly forces pushing for Bionicle to be only male. As soon as they no longer had to make all the blue good guys women, there were almost none. That said, Kina was actually a pretty interesting and well-written character. She had layers, and on the surface she was a jaded and bitter cynic about the state of the world, but in her heart she also had a softer side that she showed only to her closer friends. She was also an absolute ass-kicker, and one of the most skilled fighters on the Bara Magna arc. So, she was there, she was well written, it's just there needed to be more women in the story. The only other instance of female characters on Bara Magna were the Sisters of the Scrawl, and I'm gonna be real, the way they were written was kind of a weird choice on Greg Varshy's part. The Sisters of the Scrawl were the female members of the Scrawl tribe, who were abandoned and exiled by the males during their evacuation from their northern empire. The Sisters of the Scrawl had been granted powerful psychic abilities, and for these differences were shunned by the males. The Scrawl and their sisters were almost a parody of toxic masculinity versus toxic femininity. The male Scrawl were brutal warmongers who believed in only strength and violence. The female Scrawl were brutal without weapons, by means of manipulation and psychological attacks. The two genders hated each other, forming completely separate societies and having openly declared genocidal aspirations against each other. How exactly that would work out for them in the long run, considering, reproduction and species preservation, isn't clear, but they have stupid long lifespans anyways, so I'm sure they would have figured something out. When we look at this, especially along with the lack of female Glutorian, and how it was explicitly brought up with Ord that the Toa elements were assigned based on gender stereotypes, it could have been that Greg Varshy was planning to use these parts of the story to make a commentary about sexism, perhaps by showing that the original Spherus Magna culture was deeply sexist. This was reflected in the great beings and the gender ratio of their creations, the Matorn. Obviously, this is a very generous reading, and it might not have been the case, but like I said, Greg has implied both out of story and when looking at the direction of some of the other serials were going, that bias and prejudice were going to be major themes in the post-ending story serials. So we can see that gender in Bionicle is weird, both from an in-universe perspective and from an out-of-universe writing perspective. There's an extremely unbalanced gender dynamic among the characters, with very few female characters who were often placed in roles that emphasized feminine stereotypes, which was definitely sexist. But on the other hand, the female characters that we did have were generally very well written, and more often than not subverted the stereotypes they were put in, and were never sidelined for being girls, which in the context of a boy-marketed toy brand in the 2000s was surprisingly perspective. It's a strange nuance that deserves a lot of thought and consideration. But that's our video on female representation in the Bionicle story. What do you guys think about how women were represented in the story? Do you agree with my analysis, or do you have different opinions on this topic? Let me know in the comments. I'm always interested in hearing what you guys think. And stay tuned for the second part in this series on gender in Bionicle, where we look at transgender, non-binary, and genderqueer interpretations of the story and characters. Until next time, take care, my gathered friends.